banking crises, Carillion, Volkswagen emissions scandals, Equifax, Wirecard. We seem to be surrounded by failure, by organizations that one day are being celebrated like crazy and the next day they just somehow seem to fall apart. It's frightening to see. It makes you a little worried about the security of all the people that you do business with. But the thing that's so fascinating is they all look different, but underneath, they all follow the same pattern. At first, the narrative is, oh my God, nobody could possibly have seen this coming. There was just no way to know. And then after a little bit of digging, it turns out, well, actually a few people had a hunch. And then after the court cases and so on start to unravel, it turns out almost everybody knew. Almost everybody had seen something, heard something, felt something that made them think, ooh, this isn't quite right. This is what I call willful blindness. I first came across the term when I was asked by the BBC to write 2 plays about the collapse of Enron, I think on the basis that I was the only person they knew who could both read a balance sheet and write a play. It's a pretty small niche. And I was reading the transcript of the trial of the chairman and the CEO of Enron, and I came to the wrapping up by the judge, Simeon Lake. And he talked about the legal concept of willful blindness, and he defined it like this. He said, if there's something that you could have known and you should have known, and you somehow just managed not to know, then the law deems that you've been willfully blind because you had the opportunity for knowledge, but you shirked it. And I remember reading that at my desk, and it's kind of chill going down my spine, because I knew in companies that I'd run myself that there were moments where there were things I could have done, could have known, and should have known, and did not know. And so I became kind of mildly obsessed by this notion of willful blindness, and I started seeing it everywhere. It was an idea that was a bit like a kind of magnet introduced into iron filings, history and everything I'd seen throughout my career. There were all these incidents everywhere, and it made me really want to know, how does this happen? It seems to be ubiquitous. Maybe if we could understand it better, we could reduce it. And so I set off on a journey that, I thought, well, I'll do the research, I'll write the book, and then it'll disappear. That was the hope, anyway. I'm still on that journey. I'm still hopeful. But what came out of the research was a number of trends, a number of causes that seemed to be in every case that I looked at. And I'll run through some of these quite quickly. One was that in organizations that were extremely hierarchical, there seemed to be more willful blindness, partly because people felt, well, I'm not important enough to raise concerns. I'm just a small cog in this machine. It's not my job. There was a problem always with division of labor, which always introduces information gaps. And this is particularly the case with outsourcing, where everybody kind of has one piece of the puzzle, but because they're working separately or at great distances from each other, they don't really see how the puzzle might fit together. It's definitely the case that most people predominantly in organizations are obedient. They will do exactly as they're told. And it's also true that if you load them up with gigantic KPIs and gigantically detailed job descriptions, that they will do exactly what they've been told to do. You saw this a lot in banking, which is on nobody's job description did it say, if you think the bank's about to crash, please, hit the fire alarm. Wasn't in anybody's job descriptions, although everybody knew and talked about it over drinks. Nobody said anything, nobody did anything. And then there's conformity, which is the more we all agree, the more we all share the same perspective, the more likely it is that we're just going to stick together in our silence and this is more familiarly understood as groupthink, but what everybody forgets about Janice's groupthink theory is that the more people conform and stick together, the greater their appetite for risk becomes. They become reckless because nobody's saying, but hang on a second here. And the accumulation of these particular drivers kind of appears in one of my favorite kind of nerdy data points, which is this. In some academic literature done by two professors at the New York University Stern School of Business, they asked a broad cross-section of executives from all sorts of different industries. Do you have issues or concerns at work that you do not voice? And 85% of them said yes. That stopped me in my tracks. As a CEO, I thought, okay, so I go to all this trouble to hire all these super brilliant people and give them great working conditions and give them great challenges, and I'm getting about 15% of the intellectual content of their minds? Seriously? So why? What the heck is going on? What is the organizational silence about? And as I dug into the research and I worked with the researchers, we started thinking a lot about what was driving this. And in the American survey, the number one reason given for the silence was fear. Fear of retribution from my coworkers or my supervisor. And I looked at that and I thought, maybe that's just America, right? I mean, I'm American by birth, I'm British by marriage and passport and tax returns. I thought, the British and the Europeans, they're not like that. So I got their permission to replicate the research with the British and European cohort, and much to my horror, what came back? 85%. The only difference was the reason. The number one reason in that cohort was futility. I could say something, but it won't make any difference. So why bother? Now, I don't know which is worse, fear or futility, but I do know that our security depends fundamentally on getting the observations, the ideas, the concerns from everybody. 15% is not going to cut it. It's not going to keep me deep asleep in the middle of the night. So that leaves the huge challenge, of course, which is what do we do about this? And I want to propose a whole bunch of things. I think the first thing we have to understand is that, as you've heard from the previous speakers, we really don't know what the next 10 years looks like. To be brutally honest, we know very little about what the next year looks like. And when it comes to concerns and alerts and alarms and weak signals and all that sort of thing, we don't know who's going to pick up what. So what that means is we need everybody on this case. Everybody. We can't say, no, they're just in this department, or they're just at that level of seniority, or they just have to have these very particular skills. We need everyone. And one reason for this is because we've come to understand over the last 20 years with the use of open innovation platforms that problems are routinely identified and solved by people working outside their domain expertise. It's weird, but it's true. So a couple of examples. Incentive is an open innovation platform where a lot of companies will post some of their hardest problems, and they constantly find that they will find solutions, but not where you'd necessarily look for it. So someone looking for a biomarker for ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, as it's sometimes known, the solution came from a plant biologist. Well, it's not a plant biology problem, but he could reframe it and see it differently, and therefore see a different way to the solution. Another company looking for better solutions to oil spills found the best solution came from a cement engineer. It's not a cement problem, and cement isn't the solution, but it turns out cement engineers know a lot about viscosity, so could see a different way, saw something different that the experts didn't see. And I've had this experience in my own business when I was running my second tech company in the US. We had a gigantic problem. And when I say gigantic, what I mean is if we couldn't solve it, we would be out of business. It was an engineering problem. The engineering team had sweated night and day over it, and they couldn't find an answer. I'm not an engineer by training. I couldn't help them. So instead, I did something that a number of people laughed at me for, which is I simply brought the whole company together and I said, here is the problem. I don't know the answer. The engineering team is exhausted trying to find the answer. If anybody has any ideas, please speak up. And about a day later, a very young, inexperienced woman in the marketing department said, you know, I'm not an engineer either, but I just wondered if you thought about it like this, could you fix it like that? And that fixed the problem. She said that to me on a Friday, and on Saturday morning, one of the engineers came into work because he was so excited by the way of reframing the problem. He couldn't wait to start seeing if her solution would work, which it did, and it saved our business. But it wasn't a marketing solution, though it came from a marketeer. We need everybody. When you have total uncertainty and hugely complex problems that can be framed in any number of ways, you need everybody. In a way, what I discovered, again, along my way in doing all of this research, is that actually this is what the airline industry has been doing for a long time. Many years ago, there was a terrible plane crash. When they started doing the investigation, they discovered lots of small problems, with none of which looked serious until you put them all together, at which point they became lethal. And they thought, okay, we really need to revamp our culture, because our management is breaking all these problems into pieces so that they don't connect, and the connection is where the risk lies. And so they came up with something which eventually they named Just Culture, which had, among other things, a couple of kind of basic rules, which was anybody seeing anything that didn't look right had a duty to report it, from the janitor to the CEO. If they were passing a tap and it was dripping and you didn't know why and you didn't know if it was dangerous, you had to say something. They also said if something goes wrong, and it would have gone wrong for anybody, then you can't blame anybody. It's what they call the substitution rule. If Joe couldn't made the door break, and when Jane tried it, it broke too, don't blame either of them. The door is the problem. Fix that. And cherish the reports, and make sure you're getting them from everybody. When they first introduced it, they had about, per airline, about 5,000 reports a year. The last time I looked, it was about 15,000. It's what's made air travel the safest form of travel that we have, because no airline wants to compete on safety. Some airlines even put safety people from a rival firm on their board because they wanted hard challenge. Now, when I was finding out from people at the CAA about Just Culture and how it works, I turned to one of the lovely people helping me, a guy named Ben Elcott, and I said, well, it sounds to me, with all the NHS failures we've had, it sounds to me like this would be a really great thing to introduce into the NHS. And he said, wow, my wife works in the NHS. It never occurred to me that what I was doing was relevant to where she worked. But actually, in quite a lot of parts of the NHS now, this is exactly what they've introduced. And they've added something extra that I think makes it even more powerful. I interviewed a woman named Helena Donnelly, who had worked at Mid Staffordshire NHS, when, as some of you will know, it had all sorts of horrible, horrible things going on. And she kept trying to raise the alarm, but nobody would listen to her. And in fact, they harassed her and thought of her as a troublemaker. So she left, but she went to NHS in North Staffordshire. And there she was given a job specifically to be the person to whom any reports of discomfort or problems that just couldn't get fixed would go to her. And she would figure out what to do with them. But she said, that was great. We did that. It worked really well. But she said, the thing that made the biggest difference was every time something like that happened and we addressed it and we fixed it, we wrote it up, we put it in the newsletter, we included it in staff meetings so that everybody knew you can really get things done around here. You don't have to be afraid, and you don't have to think that it's hopeless. You have to recognize that you're not a troublemaker. You could be a hero. Narrative really matters, because you can say until you're blue in the face, oh, I'll never shoot the messenger. I always want to know what the problem is. Nobody will believe you. They will believe you when they see it, and they'll believe you when it's routine. Now, this story's kind of started, this whole, 20 years of willful blindness in my life, kind of started by researching the collapse of Enron. And that's where I want to end also. Because in the course of doing that research, I spent a lot of time with Sharon Watkins, who came to be known as the whistleblower of Enron, although she wasn't really, because I think of whistleblowers as people who go outside the organization. And Sharon was way too loyal ever to have done that. Instead, she's working in Treasury. She was deeply alarmed by what she saw as the financial fragility of the firm. And she wrote a long and detailed letter to the chief executive detailing her worries. And he called her in for a meeting, and they had a discussion, and she left thinking, that's great, now things are going to happen. Maybe it's not too late. What she didn't know was that the minute she left the office, he picked up the phone and called his lawyer to see if he could fire her. And about 2 weeks later, the firm collapsed. Sharon said two really important things to me. The first was, serial killers start with cats, by which she meant, when you see really deviant behavior that's trivial, don't think it's going to end there. Make sure it ends there, because if you just ignore it, it won't go away. But the other thing she said to me is about 2 years later, she was doing a big photo shoot with Colleen Rowley from the FBI, who had tried to raise the alert about 9/11, and another so-called whistleblower who had tried to save the telecoms firm WorldCom. And they talked about why them? Why had they been the people to speak up? Why had they been the people not to be willfully blind? And the only thing they could come up with was this. They had all grown up in towns of under 10,000 people. And what Sharon said to me was, it was just the kind of place where, if there was a storm and a tree had fallen over, you knew you had to do something. You knew you really mattered. You knew that what you did matters. So that, I think, when it comes to cybersecurity, is the big cultural challenge. Does everyone in your firm truly believe that what they do, what they say, that they matter? Because you don't want to be part of the 85% club. Thank you very much.